Hello everyone, I'm Chris Stark, I'm from BBC Radio 1 and welcome along to our session on podcast. This is all part of Radio 1 Connects. You're going to have to, I'm going to apologise a few times throughout this. So I'm currently in a curry house in Ealing called the Samrat, and I know some of you might listen to that Peter Crouch podcast, which is a podcast that I'm one of the presenters on. And we're actually, and no one knows this, it's all a bit of a secret, we're doing our end of series show, we're recording it in the Samrat, we're recording it in this curry house. So it's going to be a bit of noise going around. We've literally just bundled out of a van and got straight in here. I'll introduce you to Mr. Islam, who owns the curry house, in just a bit. And there is, of course, the potential that Peter Crouch will roll in at any minute and come say hello. But again, I can't promise that. But I just wanted to say welcome along, to tell you a little bit more about me. I present on Radio 1 with Scott Mills every day, Monday to Thursday. So 1 o'clock till 3:30 in the afternoon. I am 1/3 of that Peter Crouch podcast, which is a podcast that is made by BBC Sounds. And I also launched a podcast last week. Feels like a plug, but I'm just telling you my world of podcasts. I launched a podcast with Tom Kerridge last week called the Pirate Ship Podcast. And this session is just a really good opportunity for you guys to ask me as many questions about podcasts. And it can be anything from equipment, it can be inspiration behind podcasts, whether you should do podcasts, whether it's something that you guys should pursue or not. And to help me with this and to do most of the work, if I'm honest, we've managed to get some real professionals. We've got a brilliant panel that I'd like to introduce right now. So Leanne, and I believe everyone's just going to kind of get involved in this one at a time. Hey Leanne, do you want to say hello to everyone that's watching this right now? And just, you're my boss essentially, but I'm sure you'd like to give a bit more detail to your job.
Yeah, so my name is Leanne. I am a commissioning producer across BBC Sounds, just across a couple of different roles at the moment. So I was working across Pop Hub, which is Radio 1, One Extra, Asian Network, Radio 216 Music, and developing podcasts for those networks. I'm also transitioning to a new role, which is a commissioning producer for BBC Sounds Audio Lab. And the Audio Lab is a new scheme that we are launching in this summer, which is designed to be a creative residency program for new podcasters to give them support and basically give them a BBC Sounds commission.
Okay, so Leanne can essentially, if you've got a good enough idea here, she can be the one that gets you onto BBC Sounds. You've got to impress Leanne. That's the plan. I'd like to introduce you to Sophie K, who a lot of you will know is a radio presenter, a bit like me, but better. And Sophie, do you want to tell everyone about your podcast success? And that's what we have to call it, right? Call it what it is.
Yeah, so I launched a podcast it was literally at the start of this year. And it came from, because I'm a radio presenter in the world of rock, pop punk, emo, that world, and I could see it just like popping off on TikTok. And so I was going to people going, come on, we've got to do a show that is all about this world. And people a lot of the time don't believe in that world, even though it's like the third biggest genre on TikTok, but that's a side story. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to start something myself. It probably won't get much traction and we'll see what happens. And so I got involved with a TikTok influencer and journalist called Yasmin Suman and Alex Holcomb, who does like upcoming talent promotion. And we just do a podcast that is targeted for people in the alternative space. But rather than nerding out about music, we talk about the lifestyle. So like what it's like dating with tattoos, or and what it's like dating when you're brown with tattoos in an alt space, or LGBTQ. And yeah, we just have a lot of fun, and a lot of people seem to like it and identify with it.
It's brilliant. So guys, just start thinking about questions that you'd like to ask any of our panels so far. I'd like to introduce Steve Crossman, who is a colleague of mine from 5 Live. I mean, this guy is multi-talented. He could bore us for hours about his many achievements. But what would you like to pick on today, Steve? Is it the hurricane tapes?
Well, hang on. You introduced Sophie and you said she was better than you, and you just described me as a colleague. I mean, come on now. Come on. Sure, yeah. So I've got a podcast, as we've all got a podcast, haven't we? It's 2021. So I made a podcast called The Hurricane Tapes for BBC World Service and BBC Sounds. And most of what I do for a living is presenting 5 Live Sports. So it's essentially who is good at kicking a football and who is not quite so good at doing it. But The Hurricane Tapes was totally different. It was a murder investigation into a case which was about 60 years ago now. And it involved a boxer who'd been convicted of 3 murders that he probably didn't commit. I don't want to say didn't commit, because then you won't go and listen to the series. But if we're all plugging podcasts, Chris, then here we are. I'm very much here for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I guess what I just want to encourage here is questions for any of the different types of podcasts that you're hearing about. And over the course of the next hour or so, I think it's a really good idea to discuss different types of podcasts. It's important because there are so many different types. And I think sometimes, and it could be similar to being a presenter in radio, you might feel you have to do a certain thing or emulate a certain podcast just because it's big. And actually, you could have a very niche idea, a bit like Steve Crossman there, and make it a success and build it up. And it'd be great to discuss that today. And finally, I'd like to introduce Zoe Edwards, who is a podcast producer for Somethin Else. Hello, Zoe. Do you want to say some of the shows that you've produced? They're some of the biggest podcast names that I'm sure a lot of people will recognize.
Hi, everyone. I make podcasts at a company called Somethin Else, who are an independent production company. So I oversee things like David Tennant does a podcast with, The Crown, the official podcast. I've also worked on Ian Wright's podcast, and a load of other projects, all kinds of different shows. A lot of what I do tends to be based around clients and commercial podcasts. So that's another type of thing that we can be talking about later.
Great. So I want to get right into this straight away, because I know a lot of people that are watching this right now are probably thinking, how do I get a podcast? What is it I need to do to have this little idea and get it onto a big stage and become, one of those names that we're going to be talking about? Just in case you've just joined us, yes, these are the sounds of a curry house in Ealing. We are recording that Peter Crouch podcast tonight. It is a coincidence, if I'm honest. We're recording our final episode in the Samrat Curry House. It's all meant to be a secret, but then I realised I was doing this talk. So I thought it's better to be honest. There's going to be curry house noises going on in the background. Sophie, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. What would you say is the process of getting a podcast from nothing to something?
I think I can only tell you my process because I don't know what works for different people. But for me, what I did is I knew what podcasts I like. I've got the shortest attention span in the world. So I did some research into what resonates for me. And then I did some research into, because a lot of people say that 16-year-olds don't listen to podcasts. So I did research into why that's a thing and what podcasts are out there for people who are like 16 to 24. And then I did research into the people that I was going to be doing it with and making sure, because the main thing I think is chemistry and making sure you got a good chemistry so you can have that group that people feel like they're part of and they feel like they're sitting with you at school or in the pub or wherever it might be. But then it was about how I tell people about what we're doing. So we did mood boards on the graphics and the identity, how we were going to come across, how our posts were going to come across. We did tone of voice, how we're going to speak on social. What do we stand for? Do we agree on the same political viewpoints and all of that kind of thing, so that we had this complete identity, but also, are your audience there? Is there an audience for this? And if there isn't, and it's just you never know. You might as well try it because you never know who's going to come along. And
so that's really interesting. Did you set out then trying to get a big audience? Was that always kind of the intention? And I know that probably does seem like a stupid question, and maybe it is, but it's just sometimes I think you could maybe start a podcast just because it's something that really appeals to you, and then you throw it out there and hope that enough people will listen to it. But was it for you, Sophie? Was it quite planned in how you can get out to people and appeal to people?
I think working in a rock space, when people look at me, they instantly go, she's not for me. And so I instantly get othered in this other box. So I have to always, whatever project I do, think about how I make it relatable to everybody. So when I started, it was more about how I was going to these gigs with these bands, and I'd be stood in Alexandra Palace, and there's all of these people in this crowd, and there's nothing there for them. They're being ignored. So I was more like, rather than going, I want to be famous, it was more like, how do I get my message to all of you in a way that you can relate to it? That was kind of.
And I guess this is largely how it works from maybe a presenter or a creative person that's coming up with a podcast idea. It's important to acknowledge with this talk over the next hour that you might want to produce a podcast. So you don't necessarily want to be a presenter of a podcast, but you might just have a really, really good idea. And often I think that comes from a position of strength in knowing that actually there might be a better presenter for this, but I really understand what this idea is and believe in this idea, and how can I make that happen? So Zoe, I'd like to ask you, if possible, if you are coming at it from that angle and you want to be a producer, for example, at Something Else, how would someone go about that, would you say, or what advice would you give for someone with that mind frame?
I mean, there are so many different pathways into doing it. So again, like Sophie, I can only speak from my experience. And I actually came from a radio background as well into making podcasts. And what I would say is, it seems really overwhelming and like such a big thing, but what's wonderful about audio is you can just make it yourself. So if you have an idea and you're not a presenter, you can still mock it up. I do it all the time. It's really embarrassing. I've got loads of versions of shows that's just me like recording on voice notes and making it up. So you can learn your craft and test out ideas and make stuff before you even get into a space where you're engaging with other people with it. Now, if you're someone who independently, you go, oh, like if Sophie was like, I've got this great idea and I want to make it with a production company, you can go to a production company and say, I've got this idea, and work with them, or you can make it yourself. In the company that I work in, it's a total mixture of ideas come from everywhere. Sometimes we get briefs in from companies who say, we want to be attached to a podcast, or we've got this idea or this resource, come up with an idea. Sometimes we have our own ideas that we have to, sometimes it takes a year from idea to making a pilot. There are loads of different ways, but the one thing and the advice I can give you always is just have a go, have a practice, because it is much more accessible than you might imagine that it is.
And also, I think contacting production companies, from my experience of it, especially before I started at Radio 1, if you felt like you had a good idea, production companies live off ideas. They want to hear ideas. And you should never feel scared if you have a real strength of belief in an idea, but you don't necessarily know how to go about making it, to find the names of people that work at production companies like Something Else and just say, look, I've got this idea. They're always going to hear you out, because frankly, it's their job to find these good ideas, to then, as part of that process, and this isn't always how it works, but to then maybe take to the BBC and meet someone like Leanne and say, as a production company like Something Else, Leanne, we've got this brilliant podcast. Will you pay us, £3 million, and can we make this podcast? Obviously, I'm inflating the numbers ever so slightly.
Is that what you get to do the Crouch podcast?
But Leanne, what do people need to do? What was that, Steve?
Said, is that what you're on to make the Crouch podcast?
Absolutely not. No. Leanne, what do people need to do to impress a commissioner at BBC Sounds like yourself? And should they be thinking like
That's a really interesting question. When I look at podcast proposals, there's a few key things I look for. So I guess one thing is storytelling. What is the story? Who is telling it? And why is the story important? I'm really particularly interested in stories from underrepresented groups, different perspectives that we don't often see in mainstream media. And when I talk about this sort of thing, I often think about or talk about, can you take a topic that is relatable to wider audiences, but look at it through a particular lens, and that lens may be your identity, it may be based on your experience. It's very similar to what Sophie does in her space, but another example that I would give is Brown Girls Do It Too. The reason that podcast is so successful is that they're talking about something that everyone can relate to, which is sex and relationships, but they're talking about it through the perspective of being young Asian women and how their background impacts their view on these things. So I would think about what story you're going to tell, what perspective are you telling it from, and I wouldn't necessarily think about, in fact, I would not actually ever think at all about how you're going to try and impress a commissioner, because then you automatically get into that mindset of, okay, what does the BBC want, and how do I change what I want to say to fit what you may perceive to be like the BBC standards. But that's not what it is at all. Like, we want authentic stories, we want authentic voices, and the BBC really is just a platform to show the breadth of stories that we can tell across the UK. So don't ever think about impressing a commissioner. It's about how can you best develop your idea and tell the story in audio form that we can really amplify on BBC Sounds.
That's really good to hear, and it must be quite scary, I think, for a lot of people watching this who go, it's not just about trying to impress a commissioner, it's not a board game with certain rules to get this podcast done. The one thing that you can do is try and establish what that kind of niche is with what your podcast idea is, and have a belief in that. And then it's up to other people to back that and come along and go, yeah, we get it. We get what you're trying to do here. We get what you're about. And it's a very busy market. I think that's fair to say. So actually having a bit of faith in yourself that you're doing something different is a very good place to come from, because the BBC might not need, I hope they don't, a new That Peter Crouch podcast. They don't need, what they need is new ideas. And so I think it's important to remember to try, I think that's a really good bit of advice, but also very scary. I think that something you think might just be yourself can be something which could be made by a company like the BBC. Yeah, so thank you, Leanne. Hopefully that's quite inspiring. Steve, let's talk about a crime podcast, your crime podcast, which is obviously a very different type of podcast. How do you go about that from a kind of research point of view? How much of yourself do you put into this podcast? Does it take up a lot of your time?
Yeah. I mean, so I think the Hurricane tapes took about 18 months to make in the end. And that was essentially because I had a very, very understanding boss. So every time I came, it wasn't like they said, this is a really good idea, you've got 18 months to make this podcast. I was given a month to make it. And then I kept coming back and being like, oh, but we found this thing, so can we have a bit more time? And it just kind of snowballed until they were so financially committed that I really just had too much leverage for them to stop me. No, it was because the little things that we found along the way turned it. I mean, initially it was going to be a documentary. And I think that's one thing that I think is important about podcasts is it's kind of linked to what you were just saying, actually, about that idea of, I wouldn't think about something and think of it in the terms of, I like this idea, but I'm not sure whether it's right for X. Because if you believe in it and it speaks to you, then there's a very good chance it'll speak to a lot of other people. And in our scenario, that was because, we were making a true crime podcast for BBC Sport, essentially. And BBC Sport hadn't done a murder investigation before because why would they? But the great thing is, I think you'll find that if you come up with an idea, nobody, I would hope, is going to say to you, this isn't for us, this isn't the kind of thing we do, because I think that's kind of a real like anathema to creativity. If anything, it's the opposite. You know, you want people to be bringing you ideas that actually are different and aren't necessarily like the way we do things, because that's how you get creative products, and it's how you get, you know, in any industry, I think it's how you kind of diversify and get better. But for us, yeah, I mean, it was like an 18-month roller coaster of evidence finding and interviewing suspects and going out to America like 3 or 4 times and coming back. But the hardest thing actually was how much of myself I put in it, because to be honest, I didn't want to put much of me in. And the reason for that was, you know, what we were making was a documentary series about a Black guy who was convicted of some murders in the 1960s. And it's all about framing. And I am not qualified to tell anybody anything about what it's like to grow up as a Black man in the 1960s. So it wasn't me telling the story. It was Reuben Carter telling the story. And because we had these series of tapes that he made before he died, we actually effectively made Reuben the narrator, and I was kind of the reporter. So I was going out and sort of doing these interviews and finding stories, but most of it was coming from him, which kind of speaks to what you were saying before, is you can have a great idea, which isn't necessarily for you. You know, you can have a great idea, which, you know, kind of in your heart is better coming through somebody else's mouth. But even if that's the case, that doesn't mean that you won't be really heavily involved. Like, I spent 18 months on it, and, you know, my voice is all over the hurricane tapes. It's just that it's not my story, and I'm actually not telling big parts of it. Reuben is. And I think that's really important, is that idea in podcasts of framing. If you want to go back to a time or go to a place, then you really need somebody who is at home there and is kind of entrenched in that time or that story.
Thank you, Steve. It's I think what's really coming across is there aren't any rules, actually. I don't think there are many rules with making a podcast, and that's really important to remember. Back yourself. That seems to be and I don't want that to come across as a patronizing way, but back yourself a bit. End of the day, we make the Crouchy podcast in a pub. It's 3 guys talking in a pub. But I think why it worked for us was that resonated with a lot of people who, you know, wanted that company in their ears. And that's a different MO to what Sophie's doing, and to a lot of the stuff that Zoe's produced. Leanne, your new role at the BBC is about developing new podcast talent. And it's clearly something the BBC is looking to embrace more and more. Could you tell us a bit more about that role? Just because I think it's a role that even in my time at the BBC, I haven't seen it really. And it's a new way that the BBC is being.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something I'm really excited about, because, like you said, it's not something that the BBC's really done before. And there are different accelerator programs that are out there by other companies. But the way that this one is different is that we're essentially creating a different strand and process to the commissioning framework that we currently have. So currently, if you want to get commissioned by BBC Sounds, you need to pitch through an already existing supplier, which is a production company, and go through either an open round, which is when we put out a brief that goes to all of our production companies, and we'll get, say, like 50 to 100 proposals back, and we have to whittle that down to maybe like 2 or 3 commissions. And that happens a couple times throughout the year in the different commissioning areas across the BBC, which there are about 4 or 5. Whereas the issue with that is that there's quite a few barriers to entry. First of all, you need to know kind of the production companies, which ones make content that are in line with the type of content that you want to create. The content has to be in line with the sort of content that we're looking to commission at that time. And also, there's just very limited opportunities for individuals that have really great ideas to make their content. So the way that this is going to work is that it will be an open application for any individual over the age of 18 that has the right to work in the UK. And we would really like to hear from people who identify from an underrepresented group. So this can be Black, Asian or ethnically diverse, from a low socioeconomic background, from the LGBTQ plus community. However, and we're really looking at surfacing new and untold stories that represent the breadth of diversity across the UK. So it's a very simple application form, well, it will be, and we'll just ask for a piece of audio or creative work. And essentially, we will find a group of individuals to take on board and pair them with some production support to really help develop their idea. And what's really key here is that we will give them a commission, which means production budget to actually make the podcast that you want to make. And as in comparison to normal commissioning rounds that we would run, we will give a lot of editorial, well, the commissioners will give a lot of editorial steering as to how we need the content to sound for the particular audience if it's aligned to a network. Whereas with this, we really want to work with the creators to not only develop them as producers and presenters, but also help them to make the content that they really want to make. And it's not conform to, as I would say, as such constringent editorial standards that we would usually with some part of the podcast. So it's an additional arm to the already existing commissioning framework that we have. And it's a really exciting opportunity for people that may never usually get the opportunity to work with the BBC to come in and showcase their ideas.
Thanks, Leanne. So what I really want to do is really hammer home these roots for you guys. If you're listening to that and you're thinking, right, I need to speak to Leanne, how do we actually go about this? I need to get in touch with Sophie. I need to get in touch with Zoe. I want to message Steve because something about what he said relates. It's really important to me that you guys know that you can do. So just got a message about this. If you're signed up to the Radio 1 newsletter, they're going to send out details when this scheme is open. So what you need to do is go to the Radio 1 homepage to join the mailing list. So one practical step you can take from this, Radio 1 homepage. I don't want to sound patronizing with this, but I just want to be part of the next biggest podcast and then be there claiming credit for it at some point. So Radio 1 homepage, join this mailing list. Why not? And maybe just write that down as a little to-do thing from this talk and go and attack that one tonight. That'd be good. I really want to get onto as many questions as possible for our panel as soon as possible. But very quickly, Sophie, just before we get into the questions, I just want to ask you, what would be your one bit of advice for anyone getting into this industry? Not necessarily something to put them off, but just that one bit of advice that you look back now and go, actually, I could have just done that.
Do you know what? I wouldn't change anything because obviously everyone's journey is different. But what I would say is my bit of advice getting into this industry would be do it because you love it. Don't do it because you want to become famous. Like this should be something that you'd want to do in your free time at some and make some podcast that 4 people listen to in your free time. Don't do it because you're like, oh, I want to be on the next, I don't know, billboard or whatever. Because otherwise, because it can take a long time and you just have to have a lot of love for it. Are you ordering dinner?
No, I'm sorry. I've just got a missed call from crowd. Sorry, I was listening. So basically, I don't want to dangle this like a carrot, but I'm hoping Peter Crouch will jump on this at some point and he can explain a little bit about the podcast. But I just got a missed call from him. I'm messaging him saying, come on, like, it'd be good to get you on. But I don't know if it's happening. So my apologies, Sophie. That was totally.
No,
I'm not just ordering some food here. Right, look, let's get into some really practical questions because making a podcast can be simple. I think people can think it can be overcomplicated, and maybe at a certain standard it does because you have to bring in production companies and things like that. But at its core, what I love about doing a podcast is it's really simple. For us with the Peter Crouch podcast, it's me, Crouchy Tom, 3 microphones, producer George, who's over here. Paddy, our sound guy, is here. I've got some great stories on Paddy. This is the sound guy that will eat a packet of popcorn as he records. It's unprecedented, his techniques, but we're all learning this game. So I want to get into some questions, some really practical steps that can help you guys? Really good question, this. And I'm going to put it to Steve. Steve, if you have an idea for a podcast but don't have a co-host, is it best to find one or start it on your own? That's from Woody. I think that's a really good question. I think a lot of people will be thinking that.
Yeah, I think so I didn't have a co-host. Mine was just me. I think if you don't, I don't think you necessarily need one. Again, it depends what the subject area is, but I think if it's something you've got a real fire and passion for, then you can totally go out there and make it you. It depends what the story is. It depends who you're talking to as well. But I think that, with my podcast, because it's so much about finding a story and telling a story, it doesn't necessarily need that other person with you to bounce off. That said, if you were going to kind of try out the podcast, I would definitely recommend just getting one of your mates with you just to try and bounce it off them and see how it works. Because sometimes you could actually find a co-host without that being the plan at all in any way, shape or form. Like the guy who produced my podcast with me, we ended up bringing into the last couple of episodes because we just had so much information from various like legal documents that we were like, it's going to be so boring if I just sit there for an episode and read these documents. So we're just like, well, we'll just get the producer involved, and he became part of it. And there's a brilliant podcast called Beyond Reasonable Doubt, which is another BBC true crime one done by Chris Warburton from 5 Live. And they did the same. They got to a stage where there were so many different things that they really wanted to get into in detail that they did actually just need another person involved. But it doesn't have to be a traditional co-host. Like I think of like podcasts like Shag Married Avoid, by the way, Shag Married Annoyed, which I think is amazing. That is 2 people, but you wouldn't necessarily describe either as being a co-host. It's just 2 people chatting. So I think actually, as long as you just have a couple of people with a good relationship, then it can work. It doesn't need to be that kind of formal.
I totally agree. Guys, I've been getting away with it for years, right? I'm a presenter on Radio 1, right? I'm a presenter at the BBC. I'm not a presenter. I'm a bang average lad from Watford. And I had great chemistry with Scott Mills because we're best friends and we try and get that across the radio. And yes, I've learned to be a bit more of a presenter. But this leads into the next question, which is, we're learning. But it's about chemistry. And as Leanne said earlier, it's about authenticity. It's not about being a presenter. It's about real talk. And that's what podcasts, I think, are so special, is they're so intimate. The way you listen to them, it's so... For me personally, the podcast I love is when I really believe in the people that I'm hearing and the voices that I'm hearing. Zoe, the next question sort of links to that, and I think it's a really good question. It's coming anonymously. Any tips for confronting the fear of speaking into a microphone? I think it's a really good question because I think this links to what we were saying about having great ideas, but not necessarily having the confidence to present them. But also, I think some people will think that you have to be a polished presenter to be a presenter on the BBC. And I think a lot of us on this panel would say that isn't the case. Don't want to talk for you. That's just my input. Zoe, over to you.
Yeah, it can be really, really scary. And I've done lots of work with people who are new presenters or just trying to get some confidence. And that's the thing that is really good about podcasts, right? They're not live. It's fine. So you can take it step by step. You can do little bits every day. You can take voice notes or whatever on your phone and just get used to hearing your voice, because once you can get used to that, you can see it in a much more objective way. And this obviously depends on the perspective, right? So if you're a presenter and your aim is, I want to be a presenter and I want to do that within podcasts, versus I'm a producer and I want to tell the story myself, there's all these different ways of looking at it. So yeah, I would say you just kind of have to practice it, and you've got this lovely space where you can just, sit on your bed, get under the duvet, soundproofing, very important, and just say some stuff, read a script, just get really, really used to it. And again, if it's a story you really care about and you really believe in, just imagine that you are trying to explain it to your mum. and maybe do it with your mum there or whoever, you know, your mate. Explain it to a person and think about it as just someone you're telling the story to, because if you get really overwhelmed thinking about listeners and thinking about all that stuff, it is, I know it's really hard to put yourself out there. So have a go, have a practice, and if you find it's getting in the way of you making something or telling a story you really want to tell, there's no shame in going, do you know what, I'm not the right presenter for this, and working with somebody else. But yeah, I think just try it out. It's the only thing I can say. Just have a go.
It's really good advice. And I think, you know, I actually hate the sound of my own voice whenever I hear it, which is tricky in my job. But I think I sound ridiculous on the BBC especially. But that's just my take on it. And you don't need to talk in a certain way or to be able to have a voice. Steve Crossman, on the other hand, loves his voice, and he'll explain why that's good also.
Brilliant. Yeah, cheers. I hate my own voice. I cannot stand my own voice. It's like an octave higher than I would like it to be. I just wanted to add on the end, because I think what Zoe said is absolutely bang on. And it just got me thinking about the best piece of advice I've ever been given in broadcasting, which is when I was sitting on a train about 15 years ago and found myself sitting next to who I thought was Dominic Byrne from Radio 1. So I got him to listen to a bulletin that I'd recorded, and he gave me some feedback, and I said, thank you so much, Dom. Anyway, it turned out it was Mark Chapman, so that didn't go so well. But the thing about being a polished presenter, there was a time, it was like 30 years ago, where people wanted people who spoke like this, and this is the BBC, and you're listening to the BBC. People don't want that anymore. Which is great. They want real accents and like 30 years ago, I'm from Middlesbrough. I'm never on the radio. No chance. Like national radio. It's not going to happen. So don't try and be a broadcaster. That is the best piece of advice I've ever been given. You know, if you get someone reading a news bulletin and they're talking to you and you're like, all right, Chris, how you doing? Yeah, I'm really good. Listen, I'm just going to read the news. Middlesbrough have won 15-0. It's horrific. Like, your voice, your accent is good and it's fine and it's what people want to hear because it's real. Please don't ever feel like you need to sound a certain way, because if you did, me and Chris would have been retired many years ago.
I think we could all bond with that, with kind of how we are all currently, hopefully speaking for our panel, you know, how we are at the BBC and how we work is, you know, there is an element of hard work, obviously, and the cliches that go with it, but, you know, I think all of us have had a certain imposter syndrome at some point with our, you know, and you should, so hard to do, but once you can get past that and have a bit of confidence, you've got the right idea, you want to make a podcast, the best thing you can do is go and do it. So let's talk some real practical steps about, if you're listening to this right now and you've decided, right, I'm going to make a podcast, how do I do it? What equipment do I need? Sophie, do you want to take this one? Do you want to start with some basics about, you know, should people start just recording into their phones? Should they go and buy a microphone? What you know, what is the best route here? Or do you find a mate who has a microphone? Like, give some advice here on that front.
I think that was a really good thing you said about your phone. You'd be surprised how good the quality is on just a normal phone these days. So give it a go, like practice on your phone, try editing it, see if it's something you're enjoying and that you like doing. And then when you get to that point where you're like, right, I want to take this to the next level, you can go from like budget to big budget, like sound setups. But I'll tell you now, today that I've done Kerrang radio this morning, I was on Absolute Radio this afternoon, and now I'm doing this, and I did it all on this, which is it's just a USB mic. So I broadcast like national radio off this, and it's fine. And they cost about, I think they're about, you can get them from about 100 to 250 quid, and they just plug straight into your computer. This one's a Bear Dynamic, but you can get the Blue Yeti. A lot of people use that one. A lot of people use the Audio Technica. Plug it straight into your laptop and you can record. Yeah, there you go. There's a road. And you can plug it straight into your editing software, and it makes it so much easier.
What editing software? Oh, yes, Leanne, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to add a few other things you can use to start your podcast. So like Sophie was saying, if you've got a smartphone, the voice memo recording app on your phone is really great to use. If you just talk into it like that, the mic's at the bottom, talk into it like that, you should pick up some really good audio. And even if you're doing it in conversation over Zoom, if you and your contributor or co-host both do it at the same time and just do a 1, 2, 3 click or a clap at the start so you know when to sync it up, that works really well. You can invest in USB mics. You can invest in, I've got some really cheap, you know what, I even get the pack up now just really quickly. I got some really cheap Behringer mics off eBay, and these ones you have to get some XLR cables and connect to a Zoom. I got 3 of these for like £35, and the audio quality is really good. So for editing, if you want free software, I would recommend using Audacity. And for editing, you can basically find everything you need to know on YouTube. There are tutorials for everything. I'm like mostly self-taught, and I just go on YouTube to find things like that. And I would also,
I was exactly the same, Leanne. That's such a good bit of advice, by the way. Like, and it sounds so basic, but I even launched a podcast last week with a chef called Tom Kerridge, and I was like, right, we've got to edit this, but I've decided to take this all on myself, like try and teach myself a bit more production. And I was on YouTube.
Honestly,
you know, and I don't mind saying I was on YouTube, like learning, you know, just little bits myself, and it's such a good place to get a lot of advice.
And so don't underestimate YouTube. It's such a huge resource. In terms of music, you need to, for podcasts, you need to use music with a Creative Commons license, which means it's in the public domain, so you can use it. And there are loads of different music archive sites that you can use, but I'd usually use, there's one called Music Free Archive. And also in terms of distribution, you need to upload your podcast to a distribution platform so that your podcast will then go on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all those platforms. And the one that I like to use is anchor.fm. So that's free to use as well. So depending on kind of how much money you've got to play with, you can do it for absolutely no cost at all. Or if you want to invest in a couple mics or a Zoom device, a recording device, if you've got a couple £100, then you can do that as well. But honestly, you can start from your bedroom. I've been doing it for the last year and a half now, however long we've been in this.
The other option with this, of course, is that with the right idea, and obviously the right contacts, and that goes with anything in this type of industry, you can contact someone and then they might be able to. So for example, Leanne being a commissioner, Zoe working for a production company, you could potentially contact contacts like these and say, look, I've got an amazing idea, I really believe in it, and potentially they will then back you. So for example, if you haven't got the equipment but you've got a great idea, it might just be that, you know, you can get the resources that way and use the equipment that production companies like Zoe's at Something Else, they have that available to them. Never let it be that money is a barrier with this, because you do not need the best equipment. You genuinely don't. And even for our podcast, the Crouchy one, there are times where we record it on the hoof, on voice memos, on a train. The very best radio and podcasts that you hear are often, you'd be amazed how crappy it actually is behind the scenes. But that's all about adapting. So I just wanted to say that. But Leanne, also, if people do have a good ideas, and we've got a question on this from Catherine, is it best to present an idea or a full set of episodes to a commissioner? How deep do people need to be with a concept or an idea to come take to you to maybe get the backing to make it?
So what you will need is an overall summary of your idea, as full as you can make it at that point. And we need a short summary and a long summary. Think about how you can sum up your podcast idea in 10 words. And then what we always like to see is an example of episode themes and topics for at least 6 episodes, as well as guest suggestions if it's a guest-based podcast, as well as in details of who the host is, why they're the host, and why they're telling the story. Also, just in relation to the thing that you were just saying about don't let resources hold you back, I also just want to say there's plenty of money out there to be made, not just like from BBC, but other routes as well. especially if you're an individual, also look at some of the other podcast advertising platforms like Acast, Audio Boom. There's a new platform called Adalicious, which actually works a lot more with smaller creators, so they're really much worth getting in touch with. And what they do is they go out to advertisers and pitch your podcast for advertising spots. So listen, there's money out there to be made. Don't let resources hold you back in terms of making your podcast, and just get started.
How much money is to be made? Right, let's have this discussion as well. So let's be real, like, are we all, how many people are looking at this right now? 235 people. Are we all just, you know, cancelling all other plans, not getting any other jobs, and we're all making podcasts together? Is this going to make us millionaires from the off? Well, look, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but successful podcasts, you can earn money from it, but it's a funny one. It will never start like that straight away, or rarely will. It's something that has to build. You have to build an audience. I don't want to say it's the same as YouTube audiences. It's not. And it also depends the route that the panel have suggested, that you might partner with a production company, or you might be in the BBC. And so really, I think when you make a podcast, it's got to come from a point of, this isn't going to be my job straight away. It needs to come from a point of passion at the start. Would anyone disagree with that, or can we make it a job straight away? I'd love to, I'd like to know for myself.
Well, I tell you what, I speak to like a lot of students who are really keen to get into broadcasting, and it's interesting. Like in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say, I've gone from people who immediately ask, "How do you get into the BBC?" to people asking, "How do you get into audio?" or "How do you get into making podcasts?" And that's been a really noticeable shift for me. Now, I got into making a podcast because I work for the BBC and because I'm a journalist. So I went to uni, got a degree in broadcast journalism, started out as a commercial radio football commentator, and ended up 15 years later working for the World Service and 5 Live. So I had that platform that I built for myself, which allowed me to make a podcast. But equally, there was a girl I spoke to the other day who's just coming out of university, and she's gone to work for a company like Zoe's, who, you know, are in a space where she knows that podcasts are what she's specifically interested in, and she wanted to go and work somewhere where they make podcasts. And I would imagine, Zoe, that like somebody who has that deep within them and wants to do that specifically is probably going to be a lot more at home going down that route and going to try and work for somewhere like you work. I'm guessing it doesn't necessarily matter if they want to be a producer or a presenter. That can come later, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. We've talked a lot about ideas and the idea of an individual having an idea and taking it somewhere. Guys, I'll be real. I'm not an ideas guy. Like, that's not my strength. I answer briefs. I develop stuff that's already kind of got a nucleus most of the time. And so if you're like, I want to make podcasts, I want to learn from it, but I don't want to just, you know, put all my stuff out there right now. There are jobs, there are ways of going into companies, for example, like Somethin Else. There are lots of other companies like this where you can go in as a broadcast assistant for podcasts. You can go in as a researcher. You can go in as an assistant producer. You just need to make sure that you've got something to offer them, whether that's being really good at editing, which I say is the top tip, is get good at editing, be useful. There's lots of other things within that. And also is, you know, Steve was just saying about his pathway, kind of did lots of different things to get to making a podcast. So did mine. Don't be closed-minded to opportunities, because if you go in, for example, at my company, I know that a huge amount of the people who are producers now started out on reception. And I know that's the case across lots of radio places, like where I used to work with Sophie. That's the case. That happens all the time. You know, so there are lots of routes, and equally lots of routes that hopefully would mean that money and having equipment and being able to just DIY it isn't your only option, but it is helpful to have something to show when you go into these places to say, look what I can make, basically.
Could anyone on the panel answer this question? And I hope I pronounce your name right. Malaika. what educational routes, such as uni routes, did you guys take, and do you think it helped in your current placement in the BBC?
Oh, sorry.
I didn't study audio or radio. I studied marketing, and then before I worked at BBC, I worked in commercial radio, but marketing podcasts, and learned production on the job. So personally, no.
I would just say there's no specific route. Don't feel like you can't do it if you don't have a degree. Doesn't matter. I have an academic degree, which has only just started to come into play, making podcasts like 10, 12 years after leaving uni. You don't need that. Sometimes it helps, but even if you just do like a course on editing or production or something to get your head in it and understand it. I did that after I left uni. I went and did a part-time course just to learn how the basics of how the industry worked, because I didn't know anyone, I didn't have any contacts. So sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't, but you definitely don't have to have a degree, but sometimes that can be good to have like a basis basically for going in and doing that, but there isn't a barrier there, I wouldn't say.
I think as well, not having had that degree can be a way that if you have a critical inner voice, which I do, you can end up talking yourself out of stuff, and you can go, oh, maybe I'm not right, I should have done this, I should have. And the thing is, some of the skills that I bring to my job are skills that I learned from waitressing. Some of them are from my degree, some of them, like, you have skills to build on it, and sometimes actually it's better to go into a place and be open and be like, hi, I'm a blank sheet of paper, teach me. So it's confidence, like everyone mentioned earlier.
So I did get a degree in broadcast journalism, and it's definitely massively helped me, but at the same time I work with tons of people. Some have got degrees in broadcast journalism, some got a postgrad in audio production or a postgrad in journalism, and many don't have any of that stuff at all. I think the key thing is, what I would say is, wanting to be involved in podcasts, which is this really exciting world at the moment, that probably can feel a long way away from where you are now, but don't be disheartened by that, in that it is a destination. And I think it's just about trying to take small steps towards it and see where you go with it, because you never know. Like, you might be sitting there thinking, I'd love to be a podcast presenter. And you might start work on it and then be like, do you know what? I actually just really enjoy the production, and I enjoy being the ideas person, or I really enjoy the editing. So I think it's about trying to keep as open minded as possible, take the practical steps that you can take to start, and then see what you kind of fall in love with, and then just sort of follow that path, and don't look at other people and think, oh, but they did this. Just look at yourself and think, do you know what? This is what I'm interested in. This is my practical step. Where does that take me? Where does that take me? And most of you watching this will be so young that, I wish if someone had said this to me when I was starting out, that you can't really make a wrong decision, because you're so young to be, when you start out in this, if you go down a road and you know what, it doesn't necessarily take you exactly where you want to go, you'll still learn loads of stuff along that road, and another door or another window will open that you weren't expecting to. So just kind of go for it and see where that kind of ride takes you, and don't worry too much about, well, should I do this thing or should I do that thing? Just make the best small decision you can and keep going on to the next one and the next one and the next one.
It's really, really good advice. And I think you've touched upon a question here that Amber's asked to all of our panel. And I'd really like to just go around and ask everyone this, especially if there's, real practical steps in this that people can go and do after hearing this. And we really hope you do. We really hope this has been some use to you today. Amber's asked, what advice would you have given yourself 5/10 years ago? As Steve just talked about there. I think it's a really nice question for us to maybe sort of round this up on. Who would like to take it first? Sophie? It's a big question.
I think it is quite a big question because I think this, I'm just going to sound like a really bad meme off like some boomer Facebook page, but wherever you're at is where you're meant to be. and you're not in the wrong place. You're not failing. You're not behind. If you're stuck in unemployment, if you're stuck in a job that you hate, wherever you are, you're learning things, and you're going to take things from that going forward. And so I guess the advice I'd say is, if you want it, you'll stick at it and you'll get it. So just don't give yourself a hard time and make it more difficult getting there. Just keep looking forward and just keep doing what you got to do.
And I definitely did that. I was guilty of that as well. I remember just being really upset. I was at my mum and dad's, and like, I just desperately wanted to work at Radio 1. And I remember just thinking, like, this isn't happening. And then it was at that point that, weirdly, like a few weeks later, there was an opportunity. And it's not abnormal to feel like that as well. That's something I would really like to get across. Like, all those feelings are not abnormal. And being frustrated, even though it is a negative thing, is not a bad thing. It shows you care. And caring is the number one thing, I think, that I would give as my advice. Just really care about what you do, because as long as you back it, other people will buy into it. Hopefully, I really hope that for you anyway. Leanne, should we go to you next?
I was going to say two things, but I think I've forgotten the second thing. The first thing is, because this is something that I've learned quite recently, and I think is applicable from like earlier in my career as well. Especially in podcasting, if you're not the strongest at a certain aspect, find other collaborators to work with. You don't actually have to do the whole production by yourself, and you can learn so much from working with other people and working with collaborators. So if you're not the quickest or strongest editor, find an editor to work with that can edit your podcast. Or if, say, you want to be a producer and you need a presenter, find some like up and coming presenters to work with and like build those collaborative relationships. You can really get so much more out of a project creatively if you work on it collaboratively. And also get feedback from friends and like other podcast people, because both of those people will give you very different sets of feedback. You'll get a lot more editorial and production feedback from podcast people, but send stuff to friends and family before you put it out, because they will give you the perspective from a listener. And so bringing the two together can give you like a really good overarching set of feedback to help keep improving on your skills. So I would say look for like-minded collaborators.
Yeah, such good advice. And I look back sort of 5-10 years ago, that when you're at college or school or uni or an environment where you have a lot of people around you, at the time, you don't maybe realize the power of that. There are other people that want to be doing what you're doing. I can see the numbers that are watching this right now. Find those people, link up with them, as Leanne's saying, collaborate. Like, if you're bonded by the same thing, which is you want to make podcasts, why take it on yourself? Like, split the cost, split the effort, split the time. And also, it's exciting working with other people. It's the best thing about my job is I get to work with other people on projects, and I love it. It doesn't have to be a solo venture. You can totally go and start this thing on your own, but how exciting to go and link up with other people if you can. Leanne, you've sort of inspired me there. So thank you so much. I'm ready to go make podcasts. Zoe, we'll end with you then. 5-10 years ago, a bit of advice that you would give yourself now.
Let's go 10 years ago, shall we? Let's be honest. Actually, it's a bit more, it's to look after yourself within this, because when we're talking about audio, whether it's podcast or radio, you know, and I know Sophie will relate to this, when it's something you desperately want to do, when it's your passion, when you tell yourself that this is what I'm going to be, I'm really, really focused, and you get setbacks, it can be so heartbreaking. Don't beat yourself up. Don't stress yourself out too much. Don't work 20 hours a day. Have a sleep, have a rest, eat properly. Don't beat yourself up about it, because the worst thing you can do is you can burn out. And I've seen it, I've experienced it when you're young and you're just trying to get your foot in the door and you want to take every opportunity you possibly can. Sometimes you forget that you're a human being and you need a bit of space and time to breathe. So just look after yourself.
Really important. Guys, thank you so much. I just want to thank the panel, Leanne, Sophie, Zoe, Steve, for sharing your time and I want to say expertise, and I don't want to do anyone down here, but none of us are experts. We've all just sort of blagged it. We've all found a place where we are, and it's a mixture of hard work, belief in yourself, doubting yourself sometimes, not feeling great sometimes, feeling awesome other times. Like, it's a whole bundle of things. There is no one route with all this. But hopefully you've heard something today that has resonated with you, maybe inspired you. And we love making podcasts. So if you ever need to make some contacts, always do the little trick I did. Leanne, her name is on the Zoom there. There's probably a dot in the middle of that, and then at bbc.co.uk. Same with Steve. Sorry, Leanne, you got to give people their chances. It's not hard to connect with people. I really like what Leanne said about collaborating with people. And generally, most people in this industry are actually nice. And you can always, needs be, slide into my DMs, and I'll point you towards someone that actually knows what they're doing as well. Most importantly, stick with it. I hope this has inspired you. Big thank you to Radio 1 and Radio 1 Connects and BBC for putting this on. And shout about it on social. If you've heard one thing today that really resonates, share it with other people on your socials as well. We'd really appreciate that. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to finish with? Or should we say goodbye? We all good? All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Take care. And we'll do the awkward goodbyes. Goodbye.